The question of whether to just de-warp in the middle of space and try and sort everything out was raised again, but since we were so close to our destination, Sarge and the captain decided we should tough it out. The rest of us reluctantly agreed and put everything we could into holding out 3 more days. Reinforcements were mustered from the crew. Those wounded who could still fight were put back on the line, including a rather shaken Fumbles, and our fearless leader oh so regretfully abandoned the last of his diplomacy classes to personally take over the nastiest piece of the line. Finally, Tink and Theo were told that regardless of how creepy being around the zoanthrope was, and how important they felt their pet projects were, they now lived in the cells, and horrible things would happen to their vids if another mechanical failure occurred. It was a hectic, terrifying, and heroism-filled 3 days, which really reminded us of all our time in the Guard, though with less indiscriminate shelling and a rather inferior brand of trenchmates. Not that the armsmen of the Occurrence Border weren't good fighters, they just weren't Guardsmen. Anyway, complaints about troop quality aside, we managed to hold out without any more complete disasters. There were a few tense moments, such as when Tink got as far as reporting that a cascading suppression failure was imminent before he figured out how to use his plasma gun as a backup battery. We would have congratulated him on his ingenuity, but it took him about half an hour to remember to tell us that things had been stabilized and we weren't about to die. Another bad spot was when Sarge finally abandoned the forward power management, water purification, and toothpaste distribution room, only to have something break in it 5 minutes after he left. It took a 3-hour counteroffensive, spearheaded by all of us except Amy, to get old Bill up there to fix the thing that had gotten stuck in the what's-it. In the end, though, we made it. A few hours before our original scheduled dewarp time, but not a second too soon. We arrived in that bastion of imperial civilization widely known as that system with 2 planets and an Inquisition base that's pretty much on the way. No, not that one, the one with the blue star. As the Occurrence Border left the warp, the massive swarm of ghostly Tyranids just faded away. It was actually sort of awkward for those of us on the line, and sheer paranoia kept everyone at their posts for nearly an hour before victory was declared, and we all went off to get some sleep. The only people left awake were those who'd been augmented past the need for the pathetic meatbag concept of sleep, and those poor bastards in charge. Sarge hiked his way up to the bridge to verify that we were in the correct system, and that no stellar disasters, Xenos invasions, or heretical uprisings were occurring in it, and to send a message to the Inquisition base. Unfortunately, that last part proved unexpectedly difficult. Due to our recent problem with head-exploding waves of psychic energy, we came out of the warp way on the edge of the system. Of course, the universe despises all rational planning, so the zoanthrope stayed completely quiet during the transition, and all our careful precaution accomplished nothing aside from leaving us several days of normal space travel away from our destination. In fact, we were so far out that our sensors could barely even pick out the largest ships and stations around the planets, and it'd be days before we got into Vox range. This annoyed Sarge, who wanted to get started on the whole process of proving our identity and requesting aid so he could stop worrying. The captain sympathized with him and rather sarcastically asked Sarge if he wanted to try to make a micro-warp to get closer to the planets. Sarge told him to go fornicate with a waterfowl, and then wandered off to try and nap away his paranoia. The rest of us weren't too concerned about the travel time, since moving through normal space was downright relaxing by our standards. If left to our own devices, we probably would have spent the entire time asleep, drunk, or watching heretical cartoons. But Sarge didn't approve of idle troops. After a mere 16 hours of sleep, he dumped every one of us out of our nice warm bunks, gathered the entire team plus old Bill and Jim together, and began giving orders. The impromptu briefing started with Sarge informing us that the captain had spotted 3 ships of indeterminate size heading our way, and per tradition, Twitch interrupted to tell everyone that he had a bad feeling about this. After a few minutes had been wasted on half-comedic speculation, Sarge shared the captain's assurance that this was a perfectly normal response to how far we'd warped in. He claimed that it was, in fact, a good thing, since they'd be able to help us by passing our Vox messages on to the Inquisition base earlier than we'd expected. It'd still be over half a day before we were in range, though, and in the meantime, there were things to do. Tink and Theo were told that their pet projects were still on hold until they made sure every system in the cells was working fine and compiled yet another parts list. Doc, who was annoyingly chipper after his first real break from Gravis watching in over a week, was told to ditch the Marine on his girlfriend and get his gear ready. The Adepts were told to do whatever adepty things needed doing before we talked to whoever ran the local Inquisition base, except for the Cogitator Adept, who was told to use whatever data thingies and compuwhatsits to figure out where the ghost nids had been coming from. He responded with a lot of useless technobabble and complaints about not being a demonologist, damn it. But after Sarge glared at him for a while, he went off to his closet and got to work. Everyone else was ordered to get ready for a short expedition. A few hours later, the Cogitator Adept delivered a data slate containing what Twitch and Bill assured us was a map marking 4 locations in the occurrence border's various tainted areas. The rest of us took their words for it, and Twitch was put in charge of deciphering it into 3-dimensional directions. Sarge chose the location in the lower aft tainted section as our first target, on account of how it was near the other thing he wanted to sort out with the expedition, and we set out with old Bill and his gaggle of engineers and tech acolytes in tow. Now, we call it an expedition, and we went in heavily armed. But outside the warp, the tainted areas weren't that dangerous. Yes, they were still contaminated with warp energy, which manifested as all sorts of phenomena, but they were generally minor things like whispers, winds, flashes of movement, and the non-insectoid variety of ghost. The crutoids and other vermin which wandered into the area and wound up horribly mutilated and occasionally possessed were only a minor inconvenience, and avoiding mechanical hazards and the occasional persistent anomaly such as the time loop on subdeck U3, the room stuck at 5 degrees Kelvin, the time loop on subdeck U3, the perpetually bouncing ball, and the time loop on subdeck U3. We reached the area that the Cogitator Adept had calculated as the center of the ghost nid infestation without any incidents more serious than a tech acolyte getting slightly electrocuted and Nubby getting stuck during an attempt to bypass a leaking plasma conduit via airshaft. Unfortunately, when we got there, we didn't find any demonic portals, eldritch devices, Tyranid hives, or anything else we could cover with jetpacks. All we found at the geographic center of the ghost nid infestation was a few empty rooms and corridors. We had Fumbles take a look around just in case, but while he claimed the area were slightly more tainted than its surroundings, it seemed to him that it was likely just the side effect of being filled with ghost nids for longer. We debated exploding the entire area just on the off chance it could accomplish something, but old Bill asked us not to. So, lacking anything productive to do, we headed down to Cargo Bay E71/3, home of a few dozen plasma conduits and an insanity-inducing ancient heathen insectoid idol that had been repurposed as an architectural support. Operating on the theory that even if it wasn't related to our bug problem, it probably wasn't a good idea to have a giant eldritch statue just sitting around in a warp-tainted cargo bay, We asked old Bill to figure out a way to disentangle the plasma conduits from the idol. Not so we could study it, of course, that would be silly. We just wanted to make sure that the engines wouldn't explode or something when we destroyed the thing. Old Bill grumbled a bit about not fixing what isn't broken, but he and his boys threw a tarp over the thing's horrible, mind-shattering visage and began scavenging replacement parts from the surrounding area. A few hours later, various plasma conduits, pipes, and wires were being supported by a haphazard network of metal bands, clamps, crates of expired food, and 3 of the room's grav plates fastened to the ceiling. The tarp-covered idol was dragged to the center of the room, and a pair of meltabombs with what looked suspiciously like crossed scythe icons on their sides were fastened to it. The horrible, chittering screaming went on for quite a while, but it trailed away as we reached the edge of the tainted area, and nothing else really happened. Well, aside from an 11% drop in the efficiency of Engine 6 and half of the aft sensors overloading. Old Bill said he told us so. By the time we got back from our expedition, the distance between us and the 3 approaching ships had closed to the bare edge of our Vox system's broadcast range. Now that they were closer, our sensors had identified the ships as a Navy frigate and a pair of smaller SDF ships, so Sarge, the captain, and the adepts decided not to mess around with subtlety and announce our identity and intentions off the bat. Remembering his recent lessons on the importance of stance, dress, and overall first impressions, Sarge scrounged together a replacement for the inquisitorial costume and evil goon uniform which had been rather gleefully abandoned in a men's room garbage bin. After he'd more or less ripped Doc's evil goon uniform in half during his attempt to make it fit, he settled for wearing one of the captain's spare uniforms and hung his interrogator's rosette in clear view. Suitably outfitted, Sarge then spent nearly 2 hours with the old diplomacy adept recording a 2-minute vid which primarily consisted of his name and rank, a request that his message be forwarded to the local Inquisition base, and the digital authorization code from his rosette. This arduous task completed, he joined the rest of us for a few games of cards while the message crawled across the system at the annoyingly slow speed of light. 4 hours and several thrones lost to Nubby and fumbles later, it occurred to us that we really should have gotten a response by then. And we all trooped up to the bridge to see if something interesting had happened. We arrived just in time to hear one of the sensor techs report that all 3 approaching ships had increased their acceleration, and 4 more had left orbit. Twitch informed everyone that he had a really bad feeling about this. Over the next few hours, the vid was resent multiple times, a request for confirmation of receipt was added, an audio-only version was sent, and some tech acolytes were sent out in a shuttle to check that our Vox system was actually sending and receiving correctly. All this effort accomplished absolutely jack shit aside from increasing the acceleration of the approaching ships even further and raising the local paranoia level to amazing heights. An emergency meeting of everyone who could contribute to a serious conversation on our options was called, and the rest of us invited ourselves along anyway. There was some initial complaining by Jim, the adepts, and other such stuffy people about how the whole meeting was pointless, since no one actually knew anything useful about the situation, so all that anyone could do was make wild guesses based on hearsay and unsupported speculation. That sounded fine to us because it was how we made most of our decisions, and everything typically worked out, so we ignored their whining. The initial topic of conversation was just what in the Emperor's name was going on, and if there was any chance we could sort it out. All theories stating that the approaching ships were friendly, and there was just some sort of inexplicable reason why they just couldn't talk to us, were immediately thrown out on the grounds that the universe didn't work that way. Twitch's theory that the local naval forces had been taken over by an advanced force of demonids or possibly commandos was dismissed for similar reasons. The general consensus we arrived at was that the locals were following the astropathic kill order that had been sent out by the insane choirmaster, which had probably included something like disregard any messages they send, especially ones containing inquisitorial authorization codes. This raised a bunch of new questions, though. The primary one being, why hadn't the Inquisition rescinded that order yet? Since it was unimaginable that the Inquisition hadn't noticed a sector-wide astropathic message to kill someone, much less a whole ship of people who were in their records as inquisitorial agents, we felt that an investigation into the incident on the station had been at least started. There was, of course, the remote possibility that whoever they'd sent to investigate had completely botched things and either swallowed the choirmaster's obvious lies or been offed by the locals. But that seemed unlikely. Despite our personal experiences, the Inquisition on the whole is rather notorious for its incredulity and competence. Doc suggested that the investigator's ship could have been lost in the warp, or that other warp travel-related shenanigans had occurred, such as our own warp journey taking only a few hours of real time as opposed to the 3 weeks we'd experience. The captain shot down that last explanation, claiming to be absolutely certain for some technical reason that 3.5 weeks of real time had passed, but allowed that Doc had a point about the dangers of warp travel delaying the investigation. The diplomacy adept also raised a valid point, which was that, given the time it would take to investigate the station and our direct route, no inquisitorial couriers would have reached the system before us. This meant that any "no, these astropath exploding people are not heretics, don't kill them" order from the Inquisition would have been sent out via astropath, so there was a very real possibility that a few things got lost in translation. For instance, the no, not, and don't. Both of those explanations sounded good enough to us, but they didn't account for why the local Inquisition base wasn't doing anything, and that was a more pressing concern at present.